In 1941, led by their feisty manager Leo the Lip DeRocher, the Bums finally won a pennant, setting off wild celebrations throughout the borough.
Conquering heroes returning to Brooklyn with the first National League championship that Flatbush has seen in 21 years.
The most popular players among the Brooklyn faithful included two Southern transplants, a young shortstop from Kentucky, Harold Pee Wee Reese.
Well, how do you feel about those coming games at the Yankee Stadium?
Well, we have a good chance. I think we can beat them.
And an outfielder from Alabama, Dixie the People's Choice Walker.
It's been lots of fun winning, and I hope that we'll win the World Series and satisfy these rabid Brooklyn fans.
In the World Series, the Bums would face their New York neighbors and baseball's most successful franchise, the Yankees. What occurred in Game 4 was an omen of what would haunt the Bums for years to come.
From Ebbets Field, Brooklyn, the crucial game of the 1941 World Series.
With the Yankees leading the series 2-1, Brooklyn was on the verge of evening things up. Holding a 4-3 lead with 2 out and nobody on in the top of the 9th, Dodgers were a strike away from the win.
It looks like Brooklyn might even the series today at 2 games all.
But in one of the biggest blunders in World Series history, catcher Mickey Owen fumbled away a third strike breaking ball.
Brooklyn, a few moments ago in joyous delirium, now becomes enveloped in a pall of gloom.
The inning continued. The Yankees rallied to win the game, and the next day, the series.
I mean, we turned around and said, oh, my God, but that's the Bums. The Bums do things like that. When we screwed up, nobody screwed up like us.
2 months after the series ended, Owen's blunder became an afterthought. America was at war, and would emerge 4 years later, forever changed.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
During bitter years of war, with bad news and good, people waited for this moment, the culminating victory, the end of the war, and now it's here.
We were dancing in the streets. I remember the end of the war very well. I was 12.
Everybody was hugging each other. There were black and whites hugging each other.
As at the Times Building in New York, a wave of jubilation and thanksgiving sweeps the cities of the land.
The families are back together. It didn't matter whether you were Irish, Italian, Jewish, black, white. We were all trying to accomplish the same thing.
The post-war boom and the GI Bill promised more than ever before the good life to Americans. And people in Brooklyn were no exception. Good jobs were everywhere. And with more money to spend, Brooklynites could have some fun. Swimming and riding the roller coaster at Coney Island, and once again, rooting for the Dodgers. There was one group, though, left out of the fun. Even 1,000 miles north of the segregated South, the American dream remained elusive for blacks, even in the relative tolerance of Brooklyn.
Many people who left the South believed that they were going to freedom and to an absence of the patterns of the South. They were not. The patterns were not as sharp and as brutal, but they were there.
I say every day, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, liberty and justice for all. But there was always a little slice off that salami. That didn't mean me.
America's national pastime wasn't any different. At Ebbets, blacks could sit in the stands, but the field was off limits. Though no rule explicitly prohibited black players in the major leagues, baseball had been segregated for over half a century through a so-called gentleman's agreement among big league owners. Blacks could only play in the Negro leagues.
That's how it was, and never questioned why was it that way. Why did the owners not have black players?
On the part of blacks, there had always been a smoldering, seething resentment of all this. But it burst into the open after the war.
In the armed services are more than 500,000 colored men and women who accept the same hard training and discipline and are subject to the same dangers as the white.
You're asking them to die for their country when they can't play baseball, for God's sakes? In America's national pastime, no less?
Americans were ever so slowly beginning to question themselves about race. An unlikely radical at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn would be one of the first to take action. His name was Branch Rickey.
Mr. Rickey was the greatest baseball man. There'll never be another like him. Never. Because he loved the game and knew the game.
Branch Rickey had fallen in love with baseball as a boy. Growing up in rural Ohio, he spent his free time playing ball and devouring books about his heroes, the biggest of whom was Abraham Lincoln. Rickey, a devout Methodist, didn't drink and avoided the nightlife, preferring to spend his time thinking up new ways to win ball games and make money doing it. As general manager of the Cardinals, Rickey had pioneered the modern farm system, developing young prospects on minor league teams he controlled instead of paying for expensive veterans. It was a system that produced several World Series titles for St. Louis in the 20s and 30s. By the mid-40s, Rickey had moved on to Brooklyn after acquiring a piece of the Dodgers. One of his partners was a man named Walter O'Malley. O'Malley would handle much of the club's off-field business. Rickey would run the baseball team.
He came to Brooklyn with a great background and a great reputation. And he was very keen on looking at players and analyzing them and seeing who was going to develop into a good ball player.
What Mr. Rickey could do better than anybody I ever knew, he could classify that talent as to how much can this guy learn? Can he polish this raw talent, or will he always be brawn and no brain?
He was always thinking of ways to coach players, to school them, to improve their skills.
To mold the Dodgers into contenders, Rickey pioneered the use of pitching machines, batting cages, and other training tools. And during the war, while other teams cut back on signing players, Rickey gambled, bringing in hundreds of teenage prospects to be schooled the Dodger way. Among them, a right-handed pitcher from Indiana named Carl Erskine, a hot outfield prospect from Southern California, Edwin Donald Duke Snyder, and a New York native with a blazing fastball, Ralph Branca.
We signed on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And I went down there with my mother because I was only 18 years old, so she had a sign I was still a minor. Meeting him, I was really in awe because, you know, this was the master.
I was 17 years old, in high school. The Brooklyn Dodger scout came to my house. He said, "I'm going to sign you today."
The Dodgers had over 800 players under contract. If you faltered a little bit at the top, you got replaced. There was a lot of pressure on us individually to keep our jobs.
Any player that was sold to another club, Mr. Rickey got 15% of the action. He's the only one that ever had a deal like that in baseball.
A Dodger once quipped that Rickey loved both baseball players and money. He just hated to see the two get together.
He was frugal. He'd go in after a good year, and Mr. Rickey would say something like, "Well, son," he had this gruff voice, "well, son, you had a nice year. You're thinking about this nice raise." And then he would follow up by saying, "We've decided to let you come back." So, really?
But that was Rickey, the businessman.
He wouldn't come to the games on Sundays because it was perceived to be a sinful thing. But he was well aware of the fact that his team was playing and his team was making money.
He did have strong moral core, strong religious beliefs, and he may have, like everybody else does, adapt them to his own purposes. He was sort of the cross between an old political boss and Mahatma Gandhi. That nickname, the Mahatma, seemed appropriate, and that stuck.
For years, the Mahatma had quietly been planning his most ambitious idea, a move that drew upon his twin virtues of righteousness and thriftiness, integration.
He even said himself that this was the greatest untapped reservoir of baseball talent available. It was cheaper to go out and sign black players than to develop players in the farm systems.
Rickey meets with his board of directors in New York in 1943, and he announces his intention to integrate the team.
But if the right man and ability on the field and with control of himself off the field, if I could find that kind of a man, the American public would accept him.
Rickey called it the Great Experiment, his search for a man with the skill to excel in the big leagues while enduring the abuse